What's going on, guys? Today we're talking about the dumbbell row, how to perform them, and how to do them better than how you're probably doing them now. So the dumbbell row is a very common back movement to throw into programs, but the problem is that we often do them and kind of leave gains on the table because we're not positioning ourselves correctly and working with the lat. So the lat muscle fibers run around the body and then up slightly. So what does that indicate? That means that a pulling pattern that's gonna be similar with how those fibers are oriented is gonna be better when it comes to all around gains. So when we perform dumbbell rows, one thing that I like to do, and I'll take you through the how-to now, is position myself in a more tripod setup on a bench or on like a dumbbell rack. So if you have something a little bit higher, that works too. I don't have that available, so I'm gonna use the bench. So what we do from here is, as we set up, we're gonna allow that lat to stretch. So you can literally probably see the lat wrapping around the body. Far too often, we stop short here. I don't know why, when whoever talked about stopping their lat or their dumbbell row here, but it's leaving gains on the table because we're not actually allowing that lat to eccentrically load and stretch. So when we set up, we want to position ourselves in a way that is going to keep our spine or torso relatively neutral, but in a position that where when we row, we are able to actually rotate, fully contract, and then eccentrically load in that same movement pattern. So in practice, we are going to set, have a light brace, and then as we row, we're going to think about pushing this hand into the bench and then rowing back. So as you can see at the top here, we're getting a nice full row, a little rotation of the spine, and then we're allowing that lat to stretch. So at the bottom here, you could probably literally see my lat stretching. And for anybody who's like, oh my God, you're rotating the spine, if you look at the lumbar's position, my lumbar spine is relatively neutral throughout, but we're getting a nice rotation throughout the thoracic as we actually contract that lat. That's gonna be better for our overall growth. So a couple tips when it comes to the dumbbell row is, number one, conquer your setup. So personally, I already mentioned that I like getting to a tripod position. So foot, hand, all making contact with something stable. If you have a dumbbell rack that's a little bit higher, that's often better. You can position yourself slightly better, and it just saves you the stress of having to really be mindful of getting the hip position correctly and so forth when going through the row. The second tip I have for the dumbbell row is to mind your brace. So when we move through different exercises and use different loads and intensities, our brace should be fluid. So far too often, we take this really sharp brace and then we try to row, and I think that's honestly what limits a lot of people from actually getting the full contraction, because they're so focused on this huge brace that they can't actually get a nice slight rotation through the thoracic and allow those lat fibers to stretch. So when we are doing rows and how we are positioned and so forth, we need to scale our brace based on the load we're using and the positioning we're in. So with like this is a 70-pound dumbbell. This is by no means my max weight I could row. So my brace is not nearly as structured as what I would have with like a 110-pound dumbbell. With that, I would need to, yes, brace a little bit tighter, but your brace, it should be fluid based on the weight you're using, the rep scheme you're going with, and so forth. Don't be so structured that you're moving like a robot and not actually allowing the muscles that you're trying to target to actually do their jobs. All right, so tip number 3, and this circles back to point number 1 when it comes to our positioning, is to stop doing dumbbell rows like this. I know we're often taught how to do dumbbell rows just like this, but let's do better and let's move away from having the foot, the knee, and the hand on the bench. Why do I hate it? Well, for starters, the bench height at different gyms will be different, and it doesn't account for different anthropometrics of lifters. So longer legs, shorter lifters, taller lifters, the way they position themselves on the bench like this will all be very different. By doing a positioning like this, where we're taking more of like a tripod stance, we can be a little bit more consistent. Plus, another reason why I hate this is because when you watch lifters do these, oftentimes with heavier weight, you'll see them bias and push onto the bench. And what ends up happening is we end up limiting that contraction because we're so focused on keeping that weight over the bench because this feels more stable, that we're not actually allowing that lat to work. So how many times do you see people do dumbbell rows where they get nice and locked up into the belly? That's often the result of doing dumbbell rows on the bench like this. My 3 tips for the dumbbell row. Now let's look into some common mistakes and then we'll close the video out. All right, so 2 common mistakes with the dumbbell row. Number 1 is pulling the dumbbell row into the body. So Far too often we get in this mindset where we're almost a little bit afraid to do a little bit of thoracic rotation while doing the row. And so we end up pulling that dumbbell into the body, and what ends up happening is we end up limiting a lot of the contraction. So if we pull that dumbbell row in, what are we actually doing for the lat? We're not allowing it to actually concentrically contract throughout. The second mistake with the dumbbell row you'll often see is not being actively engaged with the feet and the other arm. Yes, this arm is doing the rowing portion, and yes, it's gonna receive a lot of the attention, but it's not the only thing that we're doing in this movement. We're also stabilizing with the legs, and we're actively bracing with this other arm. So in the how-to, I mentioned to push away from the bench. That's gonna allow us to once again get more benefit with the actual movement pattern and the contraction, and it's gonna allow us to harmoniously work with a push and pull pattern with the thoracic, so we can work on a little bit more of our compression and expansion strategies. So those are two mistakes that you'll often see with the dumbbell row. They kind of circle back into our how-to, and some of the tips kind of negate these. So if you are doing any of these mistakes, don't worry about it. Just scrap them, start fresh, and start nailing your dumbbell row better. That wraps up this dumbbell row video. As always, guys, if you have any questions about this video or anything discussed in it, drop a comment down below. And as always, drop a like, drop a subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.